Extreme cold means this is prime time to get ahead of the state's iguana problems.
For years, Florida's green invaders looked untouchable. They were everywhere, on fences, rooftops, canal banks, with numbers so high that nothing seemed to slow them down. But that picture is now changing. In places like Miami-Dade County and the surrounding Broward canals, thousands of iguanas are being systematically wiped out. Their bodies found mangled, some partially eaten, some missing entire parts. And the force behind this isn't cold weather. It's something else, something that is slaughtering them with a surgical precision that defies logic. So what exactly is taking down Florida's invasive iguanas? Florida's invasive iguanas. And why are wildlife researchers calling it the biggest ecosystem recovery in Florida's history? Let's dive in. The invasion. Before we talk about what's brutally killing them, we need to understand how Florida was overrun by green iguanas in the first place. It all started in 1964, when something unusual happened in Miami. A single exotic pet dealer, facing more animals than he could sell or keep, released over 300 green iguanas into the wild. It wasn't an accident, it was a release point. And at first, it looked harmless. Just a few lizards near canals, but Florida was already becoming a center for exotic pets. By the 1970s and 80s, iguanas were everywhere in the trade, marketed as small 6-inch starter pets for kids. Within a few years, they would grow into 5 to 6 foot long reptiles. What started as a cute pet slowly turned into something people could no longer handle. And that's where things shifted again. Owners didn't know what to do with them. Selling them was difficult. Keeping them was harder. And so a quiet solution started spreading: release. Not into forests far away, but into nearby canals. Slowly, those places became connected paths, almost like invisible highways for a growing reptile population. But there were also arrivals nobody planned for at all. Some of the earliest iguanas didn't even come through the pet trade, hiding in shipments of fruit and timber. They stepped off the docks into a new land where nothing naturally hunted them. In 1992, Hurricane Andrew hit South Florida. It destroyed entire neighborhoods, but it also broke open exotic pet facilities. Thousands of iguanas were suddenly released into the environment. What had been scattered populations became connected, and Florida itself made the situation even easier for them. The climate was not just warm, it matched their native regions almost perfectly. The landscape was full of hibiscus, orchids, bougainvillea, especially in carefully maintained gardens. In their natural environment, young iguanas would be hunted constantly by large predators. But here, in suburban Florida, there were almost no real threats. They didn't stay hidden either. Over time, they stopped being an introduced species and became part of the environment itself. And once that point was reached, the damage that followed was no longer something Florida could easily reverse. The destruction. It didn't take long for Florida to realize that this wasn't just an animal problem anymore. It was causing damage to the ground itself. At first, it was small signs people ignored. A cracked edge near a canal, soil that felt softer than usual, small dips behind sea walls that looked like normal erosion. But underneath those surfaces, something far more serious was forming. Green iguanas don't just dig small holes. They build long, connected tunnel systems, sometimes stretching up to 80 feet behind seawalls and canal banks. These burrows quietly weaken everything above them. And once that internal structure is gone, the seawall doesn't break slowly. It collapses suddenly, dropping straight into the canal. In many properties, the damage didn't stop at cracks. Repairs often cost $100,000 for a single site, but the ground wasn't the only thing being affected. Something else was happening above the surface. Iguanas often climb onto roofs and high structures to warm themselves. And because they are known carriers of salmonella, when Florida's rain comes down, it washes everything into gutters. Homeowners are forced to keep disinfecting their pools with chemicals just to make them usable again. And then there's the hidden ecological damage, which most people don't see at first. Iguanas don't just eat plants randomly, they target specific vegetation that entire species depend on. So when they strip a garden, they aren't just removing greenery, they are removing the foundation of entire local insect and bird systems without people even realizing it. Iguanas have even been responsible for electrical failures. They crawl into transformers searching for warmth, and their bodies are large enough to connect high-voltage points inside the system. The result is sudden power surges, sometimes entire grid sections shutting down multiple times in a single year. Now, with all this damage happening, the first question that comes up is, what is the government actually doing to stop it? So, let's look at the methods they've tried so far. Beyond human control. Even after the damage became impossible to ignore, Florida didn't slow down. In fact, the response became more aggressive. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission eventually allowed residents to kill iguanas. That single decision changed quiet suburbs into active hunting zones almost overnight. Places that once felt calm started looking different. People began using pellet guns, traps, and makeshift setups known as Iggy traps. In some cases, shots meant for iguanas missed their target. What was meant to control a species slowly started turning suburban areas into something unpredictable, almost chaotic in patches, a kind of local Wild West, where everyone was trying to fix the same problem in their own way. Places like Miami and Lake Worth Beach began hiring full-time professional trappers. Public money was poured into removal contracts that ran into hundreds of thousands of dollars every year. But there was a problem no one could fully solve. These animals don't stay in one place. They move through canal systems like connected highways. So even when one park was cleared completely, it didn't stay empty. Within days, sometimes even less than a week, new iguanas would appear again. It felt less like removal and more like an endless rotation. The numbers made it even worse. Biologists describe it as a kind of biological math problem. A single female iguana can lay up to 70 eggs in one clutch. So even if hundreds are removed, the population pressure never truly drops. It only resets and builds again under the surface, hidden in nests no one can easily track. And while it might already sound like too much, the story doesn't end there. When large numbers of iguanas were removed from an area, the survivors didn't weaken, they actually improved. It created a loop that no one seemed able to break. Kill more and the system adjusts. Clear an area and it fills again. For years, this pattern repeated across South Florida. What was recently seen in Palmetto Bay, Key Biscayne, and other such places is creating hope among researchers, a decline in iguana numbers that doesn't make sense. The failed government efforts and the explosive reproduction rates, the impossible discovery. For years, the iguana population followed a familiar pattern, high, consistent, and for most of the time, constantly rising. Wildlife researcher Dr. Renata Vasquez had been tracking green iguana populations across multiple sites in Miami-Dade. Same locations, same methods, visual counts and camera traps along canal banks. The kind of long-term monitoring where you don't expect surprises. And for 5 straight years, that's exactly what she saw. 3 sites didn't match the pattern. The iguana numbers were lower, not by a small margin that could be ignored, but enough to stand out clearly against everything she had recorded before. The drop continued across consecutive surveys. Something must be wrong with the data. When you've spent years watching a species behave a certain way, you don't immediately assume the system has changed. But when no error was found, even after multiple checks, and that's where things started to feel different. The first thing she noticed wasn't the absence of iguanas, it was what had been left behind. Near the edge of a canal bank, pressed into the mud, not scattered randomly, but concentrated in one area, as if something had happened there repeatedly. Then came the second piece, a carcass, an iguana, partially consumed, and the way it had been eaten wasn't random. The upper body and head were gone, while the lower portion remained. It wasn't the kind of damage caused by humans, and it didn't match the signs of decay either. It looked like a feeding pattern. Something had taken it from above, worked through it in a controlled way, and left the rest behind. That was the moment the focus shifted. Because now, the question wasn't about population decline anymore. It was about predation, and not a single isolated event, but something that could be happening repeatedly across those sites. So more cameras were placed, this time aimed higher, toward the canopy above the canal banks where iguanas usually rested. And over the next few weeks, the footage started coming in. What it showed didn't just explain the decline, it changed the direction of the entire investigation. Because this wasn't one predator, and neither of them were expected to be doing this, so let's talk about them one by one. The first predator. The first clue didn't come from the ground, it came from above. When the camera traps were adjusted, aimed higher into the tree canopy, the footage started showing a pattern that hadn't appeared in years of monitoring. Something returned to the same exact positions. It was a great horned owl, not a one-off appearance. The same predator showed up again and again, hunting in the same zones with a level of consistency that didn't look random anymore. And that consistency is what changed everything, because great horned owls have always been part of Florida's ecosystem. But what researchers were now seeing was different. This was not occasional hunting. This was targeted, repeated predation on a species. To understand why this worked so well, you have to look at what happens after sunset. As the temperature drops at night, their bodies slow down with it, and their reaction time almost disappears. By the time they settle onto branches or canal edges to rest, that hunts in complete darkness, that changes everything. The great horned owl doesn't rely on sight the way most birds do. And something even more important, it can detect heat differences, becomes an easy, visible target in the dark. And then the owl drops. Its wings make no sound as it moves through the air. By the time the iguana would even sense something, the attack is already over. The owl's talons clamp down with extreme force. Iguanas have tough, scaly skin that protects them from most birds, but the great horned owl can generate a crushing force of around 300 to 500 pounds per square inch. That is enough to snap an iguana's spine or crush its skull instantly. That explains the feeding pattern researchers started noticing. The head gone first, the upper body consumed, and something even more surprising began to show up in the footage. These owls weren't just hunting in dark, natural areas. In places like Coral Gables, they were using artificial light, backyard security lights, anything that illuminated trees or what was once meant to protect homes was now helping predators hunt. And the more iguanas spread, the easier the food source became. The feeding patterns looked different. The carcasses were more complete, the damage more extensive, and the signs didn't point to something attacking from above, which meant owls weren't the only predators showing up in the data. The second predator. In a different monitoring site, the pattern looked completely different, and the damage didn't match what an owl would leave behind. These weren't partial carcasses with the head taken first. These were full-bodied kills with signs of force that suggested something much stronger. That's when wildlife researchers reached out to the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission for movement data. What came back took time to process. GPS collar records showed a Florida panther moving through the exact same corridors where iguana numbers were dropping. Dozens of location points placed the animal directly along canal banks. That was the first shift, because Florida panthers were never expected to be here. For decades, they stayed deep within the Everglades, far from dense human development, because along those corridors, the density of iguanas was often higher than in traditional wild habitats. The physical evidence matched the data. Large male iguanas, sometimes weighing up to 15 pounds, the kind usually too big for birds, were being found with crushed neck vertebrae, the kind of injury that doesn't come from above. Panthers don't tear their prey apart the way scavengers do. They use a powerful bite, either suffocating or snapping the neck in a single motion. That was the confirmation. This wasn't accidental contact. This was active hunting. And the reason it worked so well came down to energy. Traditionally, panthers rely on deer and wild hogs, prey that requires speed, distance, and effort. But an iguana resting on a canal bank at night is something else entirely. For a predator trying to survive and expand its range, that changes the equation. It becomes a low-effort, high-reward meal. And because panthers are most active at night, and during early morning and evening hours, they are encountering iguanas at their weakest point, when their bodies have slowed, when movement is limited, when escape is almost impossible. In some cases, a single panther can move along a canal line and take multiple iguanas in one night, clearing entire stretches without much resistance. Now that you know how the great horned owl and the Florida panther are taking control of Florida's ecosystem, but very few people know the twist in this story. Because both of these predators were once in a position where recovery itself looked almost impossible, and bringing them back into the system to this level of control was something few people thought would ever happen. The unexpected ecosystem recovery. This isn't just a story about predators appearing again. It's a story about predators that were almost gone. Great horned owls, often called one of the most powerful night hunters in North America, were heavily targeted throughout the 1900s. Farmers saw them as threats to chickens and small livestock, and unregulated hunting treated them as pests. For decades, they were shot without control, and by the time Florida began to urbanize rapidly, their population in many suburban regions had already collapsed. At the same time, deforestation changed everything. Old pine and oak trees, the kind owls rely on for nesting, were cleared for development. These birds don't build nests themselves. They depend on abandoned structures or large tree cavities. Slowly, the housing that kept them in suburban areas disappeared. The Florida panther followed a similar path. By the early 1990s, fewer than 30 individuals remained in the wild. Years of habitat loss, road collisions, and genetic weakness had left them in a fragile state. They were suffering from inbreeding issues, low fertility, and physical defects that made survival even harder. The turning point came with one of the most unusual conservation efforts. In 1995, scientists introduced 8 female cougars from Texas to restore genetic diversity. That decision didn't just prevent extinction, it reshaped the population. The new generation that followed became stronger and more adaptable. It started pushing beyond deep swamp territory into edge areas where human development meets wild land. And that's where everything begins to connect. Because now, decades later, these same recovered predators are no longer isolated in disappearing habitats. They are re-entering landscapes that look completely different from the ones they left behind. Places filled with canals, open edges, and constant food sources, including invasive iguanas that were never part of the original ecosystem. So what looks like a simple increase in predator activity is actually something deeper. A system that was once stripped of its balance, slowly bringing back the very species that were removed from it. But let's be honest here, even if nature is starting to help, the scale of this invasion is still massive. And without any new large-scale measures from the Florida government, this fight doesn't seem to be ending anytime soon. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure you give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more stories like this. Until then, see you next time.